רוצה להציג את ליסה סימן. היא אחת הפעילות בקביעת תקן WAI-ARIA שאנחנו כל הזמן מדברים עליו היום. ויותר מזה, היא בעצם כתבה את הגרסה הראשונה של WAI-ARIA שאנחנו עכשיו עוסקים בה. ואני מאוד מודה לליסה שהגיעה אלינו, היא תדבר באנגלית, אבל רוב המילים זה מונחים טכניים שכולנו מכירים, אז אני משערת שאני אתדבר. בבקשה.
The first thing I'm going to start with apology and then a disclaimer. The first thing is I tend to mumble. So if I start mumbling, wave, and then I'll know to slow down. Shall we practice? I'll start mumbling and then great, okay, we'll be fine. The other thing is I'm just speaking, I'm just speaking as an individual. I'm not speaking on behalf of W3C or anything like that. So that's my disclaimer. I'm not giving any legal advice or anything like that. I'm just sharing what I know. What I want to do in this talk, I'm assuming you know a bit of accessibility in HTML and CSS, and I want to move you from there to having a basic understanding on how to use ARIA to make content accessible, especially for things like widgets. You know, your scripted jQuery things that go bump. Those are the best places for ARIA, really. Initially it was going to be 2 talks, so I had a second talk on how to test jQuery and scripts and stuff like that. So it's going to be very short summary on testing. Okay, so I'm going to give a basic introduction to why we needed ARIA, and that hopefully will answer your question on when to use what. Then I've made ARIA in 5 steps, because right now ARIA is it's a newish recommendation, so it's long to read, and you can get a bit lost in it. So I'm thinking 5 logical steps on how to, if you've got a widget, how to use ARIA to make sure it's accessible, and then shortened version of testing. Okay, and I've built a bunch on my website. I've built a bunch of mainly jQuery using ARIA examples, and they're stripped down examples. They're not doing, you know, a lot of fancy other things, making syntax easy to follow. So you can copy them and adapt them and see how I'm using it. And also, because this is a short presentation for a big topic, I'm going to give you some the 5 steps that I used to make any of these widgets, and a lot of them have the tutorial on how to apply them. So it's a short talk, but then you can go and test yourself and see if you do that right. Okay, so what's the problem with accessibility is when people make web sites and they assume they know the technology and the user, that the user system. Let's say they're assuming a screen, or they're assuming the user can see and the user can't. And so things break because they might look right, or you might assume people are using touch or mouse and they're not. So it might look right, it might function right for the so-called average mythical user, but it doesn't work for other people. In the old days, WCAG 1.0, 1999, we had things like use alt tags on images because the screen readers don't know how to read it. We had things like use headers because when you had tags instead of just fonts that looked like it was a header, actually put it in the code, it's a header. Put the semantics in the code so that different representations that aren't using a screen will know what to do with it. And then we had great advice for people: avoid scripts. Right, so that clearly is a bit outdated now. And WCAG 2.0, that wasn't, we needed to work out why scripts didn't work with screen readers, why scripts were breaking in different user scenarios. And what it was mainly a lack of semantics. When you had, say, a button, and it was an HTML button, then the semantics in the code, it was a button. And then the browser would know if someone's tabbing through the content, they need to be able to focus on this button. If they're not using a mouse or a touch screen to touch it, you need to be able to get there. You don't want to be able to tab through every word. That would be ridiculously slow. But you need to be able to get to that button. And if it doesn't know it's a button because it's a span, then it doesn't work. It needs to know what state it is. The state might change visually, just like the alt tag was visual, there was visual text and pictures. Needed to translate that. We need to give that information to the user. So we needed to make the semantics to enable people to augment the work that they're doing, so that all this information is available through the accessibility API of the operating system or whatever other mechanisms assistive technologies are using. So now we have ARIA, we don't have to tell you don't use scripts. We don't tell you to avoid scripts. You can do it. You can do all these things, and you just have to make sure that you've got the semantics there. So here's a example of imagine you're making a assistive technology for anybody. I don't know who, but you want people to be able to jump to links by pressing, every time you press A, you jump to the next link. Well, you'd be able to program it in code that worked with the first example where you've got the link being an A. But how would you know that class jump implies that it's going to look and act like a link and a jQuery triggers on that class? I mean, you're not going to know, so it's not going to work. So we have to be able to tell people that it works. Something on the way the assistive technologies work, like JAWS, is there's an accessibility API that the browser maps to, and then they read out of that API. So if the browser is mapping to the right kind of object, then the assistive technologies will work. If they're not, then it's going to think something's a text and it won't support. The objects just don't support being clickable if you're a span. So ARIA lets you say the things that you missed out when you went off and became creative in your own direction or were doing more than you could do with your native platform. What things are, like what the roles are, what they're doing, relationships, and it enables you to manage the focus. And that was the issues that were breaking it. And with ARIA, we've managed to make all different kinds of things and applications accessible. You can make them accessible. Now, it's a long specification, so I broke it down into 5 steps of what I need to do if I've got a widget and I want to make it accessible using ARIA. The first thing that I need to do is say the role. Remember that link example? I had a span, so I wouldn't know what the thing was. So I need to give it a role. Now, often the role is in the markup already, then you don't need to bother. But when it's not there, when you're doing something that changes and it's not there, then you need a role. I'm going to jump to 3, which are states and properties, just to contrast the two. A role is what a thing is. So you might say, I'm an accessibility expert. You could say, that's my role. And now I'm giving a talk on ARIA. That might be my state. States change with a session. So as an accessibility expert, you might expect me to be talking about ARIA. But it doesn't always mean that I am. It can change in the course of the session. That's the example of what a state is. States are things that change. You'd like me to stop at some point talking about ARIA. It toggles.
Even the accessibility experts are human.
Well, you need to be able to change the state, but what the thing is doesn't change. So for instance, if you've tagged something you might tag a person as a person, and the state could be, are you blogging at this particular moment? If you've written your dog is blogging, you've probably done a mistake, right? You've probably got the wrong role mapped with the wrong state. So that's where conformance comes in, because it's a way of double checking if things conform or not. because if they're supporting a state that they shouldn't be supporting, then you've probably described the thing wrong. Properties in relationships are a bit like states. They change with every instance, but they don't change that fast. So normally within a session, they're not going to change. So, taking a person example, a person might have, children, or that they've got relationships with things. A label has a relationship with the control that it's labeling. That doesn't change really fast in the course of the session. Those are like author-settable. So you want to set the roles, you want to set properties and relationships, states that change. Now, when you've got a state, when you change states, you have to change it also in markup, right? So you need to toggle that state. Something very annoying that I see is when people think they're going to make it accessible by putting on the role, and maybe they'll even remember to set the state. But when the state changes in a jQuery, they don't remember to toggle the value in with the ARIA state. So then that's really unhelpful. And finally, you've got to make sure that you can use it with the keyboard, which means you can tab to it, you can get to it, and it's usable through the keyboard. So roles are just, well, I kind of did this already. All right, starting with roles, very simple roles is, this is just your landmark roles. You've got something to do is you enclose the content inside the different landmarks, and that enables different users to jump through the content to the right part. Relationships, what are relationships? Well, examples of very common relationships that people should want to put in: ARIA labeled by, ARIA described by. The tabs label the tab panel. So that's a relationship. Another very, very common one, almost every time you go to a form, you've got things that are describing the control. Now, if you look at the little form thing there, I've written at the bottom, this search my site, not the web, or something like that. Well, it's after the go button. So if someone's hearing it sequentially through a screen reader, they're going to have pressed go and left the page before they realize that the function's the wrong function. So visually it's all presented at the same time, but having that relationship encoded is really useful. So you put in ARIA described by, and then if someone's got focus on the screen readers will know to read that information together. Controlled is another really useful one. It lets you jump from the controls to the results of the control. So for instance, if you have your tab panels, when you press tab, you can then jump to the tab panel. So you can say this section, the tab list, controls the tab panels. And that's lovely if you've got search results. So you can jump your way around the complex page. And also hierarchy and group structures, what belongs with that. Okay, states and author-settable properties. Right, so states are things that change, and they're normally changeable by the user. So properties tend to be things changeable that the author set, and states, you do something and it changes state. Okay, so those are our 5 steps. And then we've got the keyboard, which I'll get to in more detail as we go through. Short example. Okay, I have a span and it's a button. Maybe I've got some text further down in the middle of the page that you might want a yellow background. So it's a span. It's not accessible. You can see you can't jump to, you can't tab to it. You can't give it focus. Doesn't work. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is step 1. Step 1 was roll. Give it a roll. Rolls button. Okay, then it's mapped to the right thing. Step 2. Step 2 was relationships. Now, just to make it usable, I've stuck in a little bit of text that says, use this button to whatever, to turn your text yellow. So I want to hear it when my button gets focused. So the second thing to do is put in the relationships. Okay, step 3 is states. When you opened the page, the state was visual, right? It might be a picture of a 3D button that's not pressed. But you've got to give that information, that picture is giving the sighted user. You have to give it to the assistive technologies. So you need to set the state. Okay, step 4 was toggle the state. Now, when you made this button, this is not so hard because when you made the button, you already had an if statement somewhere that said, if it's clicked, do this. So all that is already there. I have that if this button gets clicked, then I'm going to change my classes or change my image. So at the same time, do a copy and paste and change the state. That's it. So notice I haven't really been very intrusive so far. Okay. Not sure what to change there. Yeah, do it both ways. When you set it, don't just change it when you clicked, when you pressed it, but when you press it again and it's unselected, remember, you know, whenever it's changing, it needs to change the state in both directions.
Manage your state.
Manage your state, yeah. Okay, so step 1 was role, step 2 was relationships, step 3 was the state, step 4 was remembering to change the state, because otherwise you'll forget. And step 5 was managing the focus in the keyboard. I'm breaking this one up into 3. First, you need to be able to reach it, and that's Tabindex. Second, the events. If it was a mouse over event or something like that, that event has to be keyboard accessible. It has to work when you're using a keyboard. It might not be. And that's standard accessibility. You don't need to be in ARIA to need to do that, but it often is a problem when people are using ARIA and they forgot that one. And the other is that the user should know what to do. And so if you've got some interaction that you press F5 to close this dialogue, the user's not going to think of that. So you need to think about the standard design patterns and use them also with the keyboard. So escape, for instance, would close your dialogue. Okay, so here, the first one of those, that focus keyboard was Tabindex. Tabindex it puts this span into the tabbing order, enables it to get focus. It tells the browser, which tells the operating system, this is a control. This isn't just a piece of text, it's a control. So I need to be able to get to it. So now it supports just stick in Tabindex, and that job is done. And here's the 3 points that Neil already mentioned. Okay, the 3 settings for Tabindex. This is like a standard script. You can make it completely generic. But basically, I'm saying if you've got the click event, which normally is interoperable, but less so if you're using a span, because spans don't support click. So you might want to have, or you probably need, key down jQuery, right? Whenever you've got the jQuery key down, whenever you've got the key down event, as what do the click. And then I don't have to copy over the code. I can make it generic whenever I've got class button or whatever, and it had to press go and do this. So it's like a magic little jQuery, and all the buttons work. This one's specific to that ID, but you know, or you can just augment it in each time you've got a click event or mouse down or anything like that. So here's an example. My example is of a tooltip, mouse over tooltip. We've all seen it, right? Nice and inaccessible. So step 1 was the role. Okay, so I need to put the role. Step 2, anyone remember step 2? Relationships, that's right, well done. So step 2 is relationships, so I need to put the relationship in. When I've got whatever I've got my input, I need to say it's described by this tooltip. Okay, Step 3 was the state, putting in the state. And the state of the tooltip at the beginning is hidden. Okay. Next, what was the next one? Step 4.
Managing the state?
Managing the state. Brilliant. Okay. So I've got some. One thing you can do when you're making them from scratch, you can actually use CSS selectors, so that it's the other way around. You can have the you can just program that the visual changes when the state changes. And actually, this is really rather nice because people use CSS classes as states. You know, pressed, not pressed. But CSS classes aren't really, I mean, a designer could come and change them, or states are states. So if you're designing things from scratch and you're used to using ARIA, you might want to do, instead of when the class changes, the state change, you might want to do when the state changes, the class changes, which is a more logical, programmatically sensible way of doing things. So it's like a service that we're providing to the community, that you've got states. You can use them. Backward compatibility, what you were talking about, progressive, if you're worried that it's not going to work well, then you can also change the class or change the image or something like that. And finally, it should be intuitive. So we're going to want to leave it. Oh, no, sorry, the next one was we had a mouse over. Okay, mouse overs don't work if you're not using a mouse. Okay, so we want to focus. We want to use the focus event. Now, here I've done it separately, made a whole redundant thing where exactly the same thing is triggering on the focus. But you don't have to. If you see at the bottom, you can just put the word, if you're using jQuery, you can just concatenate and stick the focus in and you're done. So that was one word you needed in the script. And then intuitive. What we would usually do is say, what would you do as users? And you've got a little dialogue open. How would you want to, and you want to close it, what would you press? Escape. Escape, right. So often with these dialogues, don't close on escape because they're expecting you to click outside the region, and that's what's going to close it. But make sure there's some way of changing it that the user's going to want the design patterns. And there's a document in a W3C of design patterns that if you're making something you might want to look at, because these are taking the design patterns from either Windows or Apple, and they're what people are used to seeing. So, you know, this is just the escape key code and closes it. And obviously, if you've got it under some other function, you can concatenate or something like that. Okay, so another example, we've got a form. This, I'm sure all of you are doing, right? You've got a form, and you pressed go, your thing was empty, and you get an error message. Okay. What do you think probably here needs a role? There's an error message pops up when you press go. Step 1 was set roles. What probably needs a role? I'm assuming that they could need roles, but let's assume that you used HTML. Why not? Well, what you probably didn't realize was that the error message is something that changes. It's not normal text. And the trick of knowing, one of the tricks of knowing where roles might be missing is things that change. If something changes, it either should have been an HTML control or it needs a role. And even if it's an HTML control, check that that's really the expected behavior. So things that change, that error message that is there if you make an error that says, you know, you need to put in some information, that probably needed a role. Okay, relationships. I'm going to go back up because I'm cheating. Relationships. Do you think there's a relationship missing? Probably, if you haven't used ARIA. Right, so it's labeled by the search, and it's described by the word search, and it's got instructions. Okay, using ARIA described by for instructions is something that most, what format you're meant to put it in, most forms forget to put in, and that's really useful. Because otherwise they don't know. They press go, and they didn't know that they were meant to use this format. So that would be the next one. Steps, yeah, sorry.
But if you use label on this label that is for this input, so
right.
it can replace the ARIA in this case?
If you use label, you probably put label. You probably put label on the search. This search box is labeled by ARIA. Sorry, the search. The word search is probably the label, or should be the label.
Yeah. So
you can't use it twice. No, you can't.
Because jQuery validation plugin does exactly that. It adds another, the error message is actually a label.
A label?
It's another label that you already have.
It's non-conformant.
Okay.
What can I tell you? I'm a W3C. This is why it's there. It's not really the label of the thing. It's an error message.
Yeah, it's a message.
Okay, so states. Any ideas for states? There's a state change. Again, things that change need states. They change the way they look. What changed the way it looked? Sorry?
The visibility of the error message.
Right. The error message wasn't there, and now it is. So things that change, they need to change the state, which means they needed to have a state. And in this case, it's ARIA hidden. Okay.
Some states are implicit.
States are implicit. No, not in ARIA. Yeah, they might be in ARIA 2.0. It's a big discussion now of if they should make, implicit states or not. There might be one or two. There might be some defaults, but
we can consider default states as
right, implicit
states.
Yeah, right? I'm not sure if there are any in 1.0. It's a discussion for ARIA 2. Is should they make them implicit?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right, and then focus. Okay, and then focus, because you're using an alert. If you put this as an alert role on the message, alerts are lovely because the whole focus is managed for you, so you don't need to bother. I was meant to talk briefly about testing, so I'll do it very, very briefly because I've only got 5 minutes left. There are more examples on my website, and in fact more complete examples of what you just saw as well. If you want to test if it works, the first test that I have are what I call think tests, which is basically look if anything's changing. Think about it, what's changed, go through those 5 steps and apply them. And if you see things changing, are their states changing? It's thinking, applying basically how you do it. Then check it in the specifications, because let's say you have a tab list and it's meant to contain a tab. Well, if it didn't, you've messed up the programming. So the specifications, the requirements, they're not overly finicky. They're things like if you've got a tab list, it needs to contain a tab. So that kind of level of conformance, it won't work if you haven't conformed to that. The tab test is whenever I'm testing a website, I tab through the whole page and I check that all the things that I can act on, all the controls can get focus. And then I tab backwards. And I also check at the same time that nothing strange happens when they get focus, like all of a sudden I move to a different page or something awful like that, because that's how a screen reader user or other assistive technologies will use the page. Then I try and use it, do any functions, put in the date, using the date widget thing, using the keyboard. And then I've also got testing with a screen reader. obviously that gives a feeling that you're never going to get with a test, but you also have to think. It's not, oh, I used a screen reader on it, because there's visual information, and if you're just using it with a screen reader, you might not know that the visual information is there. So still think about those 5 ARIA points when you're using it. Is it labeled? Are the relationships there? Because if you're putting that search information in, you know that you're testing on the web. So you might not notice that the ARIA described by is missing, unless you're actually thinking at the same time. I have on my website, there's some things in Hebrew, mainly it's in English. So I have the examples of the tab panel and the tooltip. And I've also made some test pages of things that go wrong. So you can test your understanding of your testing skills, if you like. I've got like a nasty page of the live regions, where you're being told that something's assertive and it's not assertive and all that kind of thing. So you can test your debugging skills. And also, if people are interested, I made this, which is like a unit test page, so that you can test testing tools. So you can feel free to add, if you've got a unit test that you want to put in here, into the database. And for some reason, it's not going onto the screen. But the unit test page will allow you then to test the testing tools, because ARIA isn't well tested with testing tools. So if you want to see what you can rely on, how much you can rely, you can also add these things.